So I'd like to welcome you all to Eliminating Disengagement in the Workplace webinar. So we're really grateful that you could take the time and carve it out of your day to join us. I know you've probably all got really busy schedules, but we're super excited and honored that this topic has generated interest from folks from such a wide variety of industries and countries. I looked at the sign-up list today and it was pretty incredible, and so we're super excited about that. My name is Alex. I'm the project manager at nRhythm, and I'm currently based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So you'll have the opportunity to learn a lot more about nRhythm and our work and approach on today's webinar. And today I'm super excited to welcome Trey Cates, who's the founder and managing director of nRhythm, and he'll be the one sharing more about our approach to organizational design and development, as well as a little more about his background. But first, I have a couple of logistical announcements and housekeeping things I wanted to cover. So we've scheduled 60 minutes for today, and we're going to save time for Q&A at the end. So you're welcome to keep your questions coming in the chat. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Zoom, there's a little chat button at the bottom in your navigation screen on the bottom of your Zoom screen where you'll be able to access that. So yeah, please keep your questions coming in the chat. I'll be monitoring that and I'll make sure we can address them. But also at the end, you're more than welcome to unmute yourself and we can actually have a conversation. This webinar is being recorded and you'll have access to the recording and slides afterwards. We'll send it out by email in case you'd like to either share the webinar or access it again. Throughout the webinar, please try and keep your mics muted just to enable optimal sound quality. You're also welcome to turn your video on so that we can make the experience a little more human and personal, given that we're in this remote environment. We like to do that as much as possible. And then, yeah, but as we get started, I'd love to learn more about where everyone's dialing in from. So if you could share your name, where you're calling in from, and maybe a little bit about what sparked your interest in this webinar today. We'd love to learn a little more about that and create some connectivity among all of you. On previous webinars, some folks have actually fostered new connections and collaborations through that. So we hope, yeah, to create a little more connectivity today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Trey.
Great. Thank you, Alex. And welcome, everyone. Super excited about engaging in a conversation with you today. A little bit about my background. I've been an entrepreneur and operator all of my career. I have spent a lot of time in multiple different environments, from starting tech companies to running nonprofits and to building and being a part of designing and building and supporting a global network. nRhythm kind of emerged out of supporting organizations and the goals or the impact that they're wanting to make, and we're super excited to continue to do that. But we believe that the majority of the solutions we use today to try to support these organizational efforts, we think can be improved. And so we'll get to talk a little bit about some of the outcomes and challenges we see within organizations or other collaboratives, and what nRhythm and other organizations and people around the world are doing to provide different alternatives to the current challenges we face today. So what the topic is today is about eliminating disengagement. And part of the way for us to address this within organizations is beginning with understanding it. And so I even start off with the title of chronic disease and a question mark. I think a lot of times we see disengagement as a problem employee or team member. And we're going to reframe that a little bit today. And that doesn't mean there isn't individual responsibility that we all have as we participate in roles and have responsibilities in organizations. But today we're going to talk about, is there anything we're doing that's actually creating it? And is it chronic versus just tied to an individual member of our organization? So with that in mind, I'm going to kind of begin and we'll start going from there. So in terms of expectations today, we're going to talk about understanding the problem. We're going to give you some different perspectives and options around what we call a living systems design, and then begin to talk about what about that is principle-based versus what we call prescription-oriented solutions, and then how nRhythm's framework, or what we call the regenerative framework, can support and help us in this process. And so when we talk about this, one of the things that we always do is begin with a question that helps us understand where we're currently coming from. So the question is, what is the dominant metaphor for how we organize ourselves? And this is not a rhetorical question. I think we're a small enough group that if you want to unmute yourself or actually answer this question, feel free to do so. But what is the dominant metaphor for how we organize ourselves? Anybody want to begin?
I potentially have an answer. I don't think there's just one answer. Hi, everyone. I'm Ellen, also in Minneapolis with an organization called Environmental Initiative. And I think in largely, United States, Western society, a metaphor that comes to my mind is a pyramid, a hierarchical mode and model of organization that has a top and a bottom.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ellen. That's perfect. Elliot, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask for, excuse me. Hi, I'm Elliot, everyone, Elliot Powell, and I work with an organization called Sustainable Harvest International, and I'm based in New Orleans, Louisiana. Something to that effect, honestly, was hierarchy based. I didn't really have a better metaphor. A pyramid is great because I think that actually is more to the point. And specifically for my organization, we find it a lot because we work across many cultures as well. And so we have global north, global south. We have different languages, how they approach, different cultures approach the workplace very differently. So there's a constant back and forth of that. So at any rate, I appreciate the pyramid metaphor, and I'd say it's spot on.
Great, very good. Yeah, I definitely think there are many different metaphors that we use to describe our organizations. It could be our individual organizations, or could be our country, could be the educational system, multiple different entities that we would describe by using metaphors. And the thing is the metaphor is a powerful image. And what I think, though, is even encompassing kind of this hierarchical or pyramid is a metaphor that I think even is more encompassing than that. And that comes to this machine as a metaphor. And it infiltrates every bit of how we communicate, how we design. And so you can imagine here on the left side of the screen that if we see our organization as cogs and all these different moving parts, it probably starts to impact how you see people that are within that organization, right? And here on the right-hand side, we've got even an economy that's being and seeing itself as a state in the United States as a machine. And so the question becomes, our language follows that fairly quickly, right? So you may even remember yourself saying some of these things like, hey, this is working like a well-oiled machine, or I don't have bandwidth for that, or we've got to dial that in, or we got to move the needle on that. And all of this is really coming from this really a Newtonian perspective of we can really make progress if we just see ourselves in this idea of cogs and parts and pulleys that allow for us to accomplish even more, right? And what's interesting though is when we began to see ourselves in that same way, even the human body began to take that form with the way we were describing things. So arms were seen as pulleys, pumps were seen as the heart. But it changes, and it has a substantial impact in terms of the consequences of seeing ourselves being organized like a machine. I think it creates pretty substantial impacts in our organizations. And not surprisingly, which is the title of Disengagement, is what it does with people, right? So Gallup and several other research organizations have done a number of surveys, both in the US and across the US, that talk about what disengagement is. But I don't see disengagement being just something that we may approach and blame the millennials for, right? So how many times have you said, oh, it's this next generation, they're the reason why there's so much disengagement. I actually don't believe that to be the case. I move us back into, so what about our current situation is so informed about how we see the environment that people are a part of. So 13% are what most organizations, research organizations, are saying engaged in an organization, whereas in 63% are not engaged, all the way to the idea of 24% being actively disengaged. Well, to me, interestingly, it's not just people that we see this in, because when we see this machine paradigm, it infiltrates not just the idea of how we see our organizations, but I think it's how we treat our planet. It's how we treat our societies. And so it's not surprising to me that same paradigm substantially impacts how we manage resources from a planetary standpoint. And so what happens? I actually think that part of this approach influences the diversity that we have both in our organizations, in our societies, and in the planet, in addition to even economies. I mean, where do we see it being good that current structures has allowed for even an individual to have as much wealth as an entire country? I think all of that comes back to really giving us insight into, is this a design issue? And obviously from an nRhythm standpoint, and me personally, we firmly believe it's a design issue. Those outcomes are a design and a result and a consequence of the current system. Now, we don't see it as a silver bullet, but we do think the environments that you create the conditions for what a lot of what we experience is. And so with that in mind, we began to start saying, well, if it's a design issue, what is it that we can do to design with and for different outcomes? And so what's the problem? Well, in a ongoing way for us to be able to talk about it, we really see it as an issue of applying our design to the wrong problem. And so we use this as an example, this idea of, if we're trying to bake a cake, that's a simple challenge or a simple problem, and it's pretty easy to replicate. There are ingredients lists and recipes and known steps, and we really have pretty strong anecdotal evidence that we can repeat that and get the same outcomes over and over and over again. And we've actually been able to show that even in terms of this complicated problem that we have, where we've been trying to get people to the moon or build rockets, create opportunities that are very complicated, but there are blueprints and there are steps and there are assumptions that can be managed that guarantee a pretty strong repeat of the outcomes. But when we talk about complexity, which I think our environments are, our social environments, our environmental contexts like natural environments, excuse me, there are a lot of interdependent inputs. A lot of the situations are different. And there are no way to replicate and get predictable outcomes. And so with that in mind, when we talk about it being a design issue, we actually really believe that in light of that, we've taken what would be complicated inputs, series of steps, and predictable outputs, and we've applied it to complex challenges where there are interdependencies and nonlinear change, and things become quickly unpredictable. And so our environments, organizations, when we apply that complicated or simple approach to a complex environment, I believe you get disengagement. Because what happens is we're forced to treat everything and everybody very similarly. And in a living environment or a complex one, I think the unintended consequence of that is disengagement. And that disengagement is a result of being treated the same as everybody else. So we see this, and this now infiltrates everything. So we see our healthcare organizations, but they really are complex systems versus machines. And we see our educational systems as complex systems versus machines. And if we can begin to reframe that conversation, I begin to believe that some of the things that we're experiencing right now, where we get this actively disengaged, where 50 to 65% of our team members and organizations are in that category, maybe if we change how that's designed, we get the actively engaged that I think can be so much more powerful in organizations. Now, we all know that this is the last way that we want to feel. But I have spent a lot of time with large organizations, small organizations. I've interviewed hundreds and even probably thousands of people that actually feel that they're just a commoditized resource. And so what we're trying to do is recognize that disengagement isn't about just changing a practice. It's about changing the system. And the only way we can do that is take a designed approach. So when we talk about what the consequence of that is, I think we get into some of the stats that really become meaningful that I didn't talk about before, which is anywhere from 350 to could be as high as $600 billion a year of lost productivity because of these design issues. And the thing is it is actively a challenge in an organization, yet most organizations have chosen to continue to try to solve the problem using this typical machine approach, this machine paradigm. And it's not just productivity, because I really want to make sure that when we talk about this, it's not just about what and how people produce in an organization, because I think it isn't just measured that way, but we're beginning to recognize it's a serious health issue. And actually in Rhythm, we begin to reframe the conversation within organizations as, what does it look like for you to create the conditions for health, and not just physical health, but that system health, or the health of the individual and the roles that they're playing, and the emotional intelligence that's needed as a part of that process. And so where you see individuals that are a part of systems where their own well-being is suffering as a result of its current design. Now, I know that we're talking about some real systemic as well as global challenges, but I do think we have the opportunity in the relationships that we're a part of, in the teams that we're engaging in, even if it's a team of just 10 people, to be able to change the dynamics that are impacting the energy of the people that we're in relationship with. So what we want to do is, instead of seeing machine as a metaphor, what if we see life as a metaphor and really design with life in mind? And what does that change in reference to engagement within organizations? Now, for us, one of the things I'll do is I'll step back briefly and just ask the question, or actually create the information around how we've come to that conclusion. We follow a little bit of this systems view of life that comes out of the Santiago School in Chile, where they took a holistic or a systems approach to addressing what is life. And what's interesting is they examined and really mapped all of the chemical, material, and energetic pathways within a bacteria. And they really came to two interesting things. One is that life is what we know is its ability to self-maintain and self-regenerate. And so they even coined the term autopoiesis, which is this idea of self-poetry. And we don't need to make immediate connections to it, but just begin to recognize, so what about our organizations or these complex systems? Have we created the conditions for that self-maintenance and self-regeneration? Or is it more created as a machine that really is only running at the expense of those natural resources? So what does it look like for an organization to self-maintain and self-regenerate? So what they discovered and what they came up with has really informed our work, is that life really is an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. So what we see is living is regenerative and regenerative is living. And we actually believe when you have a living regenerative environment, it eliminates the substantial chronic disease of disengagement, because it's an environment that allows people the opportunity to thrive. So what they found is so then when you start talking about it, and it came up both in a couple of the comments from Ellen and Elliot, so where is life? You know, of course, life sits in the top of the triangle, right? Where all the decisions are being made and it's command and control. But what they found is, even in cells, even in these bacteria, that, you know, life wasn't located in any one place. That really it was dependent upon all the interconnected relationships, and that ultimately it really was an emergent property of all of that interconnectedness. And that it really was this dance, this self-poetry, this autopoetic process and system that allowed for all the wholes or all of life to thrive as a part of its design. Now, what's interesting is they began to then say, what is death? And what they discovered is death is the inability to self-regenerate and the lack of interconnected relationships. So when you think about the human body, for instance, you can imagine that the way this would look is, on the left, we have life, right? And we think of the human body when the heart and the brain and the stomach and the lungs and all those things are working well with one another, it supports life. But when it's disconnected, it's not. Now, we know we can use technology to allow for some of those things like the heart to live outside of the body. But that's because it needs substantial inputs, energy from some other source to keep it alive. But in the context of a body, it's self-regenerating, and it actually is because of its connectedness. But when that doesn't exist, that is death. So when you think about an organization, imagine disengagement. We've all experienced silos in organizations. What happens when an organization looks like what it looks like on the left versus what it looks like on the right? And is it that lack of interconnectedness that should exist in an organization actually is creating the conditions for people to disengage, for organizations to be siloed, for productivity and really health to be undermined at the expense of, the underlying, the productivity or the desired outcomes of that organization. And we'll take it one step further. What does it look like when we recognize people within a team? So here we've got life on the left. This is, let's just call it the marketing team, where they're really working with one another and really creating the conditions for a healthy environment, or one where everybody is doing their own thing, just following the job descriptions, their roles and responsibilities, but not connected as a part of that team dynamic. So really, when we're thinking about disengagement, we see disengagement through the lens of how we design versus just behavior. And that's one of the changes that we really encourage owners, team leaders, executive management teams, or team participants, is to recognize that behavior usually is at least more complex than we want to admit, and that it's not just tied to someone showing up and having a bad day, or part of what's going on in their specific job functions, but it's a part of the environment that they're a part of. And what can we do to participate in creating something that's different? So here's what I want us to do. We want to take an individual exercise and take a couple of minutes, and then we're going to open it up. Is I want you to think through and to identify common practices in an organization, and I want you to segment them into either the life paradigm or the machine paradigm. So let me repeat that. You're going to identify common practices you see in an organization, and you may even connect them to disengagement on a team or a larger cross-departmental project. And I want you to segment them into either the life paradigm or the machine paradigm. And we're going to spend a couple of minutes talking through that. So let's take 5 minutes and just write them down, and then we'll open it up for conversation. Okay, who wants to go first? Anybody want to take a crack at, describing the practice and how it fits into, or a couple examples of how it fits into a life or a machine paradigm?
I can kick it off, Trey.
Okay.
So I was thinking about performance reviews and how commonly they're just a way to kind of benchmark an employee's performance that doesn't take into account things like the health of the organization or the design, or maybe even not necessarily the fit, but just really the outcomes that that person's producing. So I kind of characterize that most commonly in many organizations as kind of a machine paradigm practice.
Great example, Alex. Thank you. Somebody else?
Hey, this is Ellen again. I was thinking of that same example, Alex, and another one that came to mind for me is kind of like a formal training program where you'd have an identified expert sort of imparting wisdom or knowledge in more of a unidirectional fashion versus pure learning, and creating environments where we can all acknowledge, recognize, and benefit from the wisdom that we each bring.
Awesome. Thank you, Ellen. Great example. Somebody else.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Those other two examples were really good. Something that comes to mind is this, is reporting out results of your organization. And there's a real, there's a real desire for people to hear about numbers and not actually talk about what's in the numbers. So this difference of like outputs and outcomes. And I think outputs fit really squarely in machine, not to say that they're not necessary, but there's a lot lacking, while outcomes dig a lot deeper into behavior changes and what more is going on there.
Thanks, Elliot. Yeah, absolutely. And even the language, inputs, outcomes, right? So fantastic. Thank you. Anybody else? One more person. Nobody's going to take me up on an example. All right, so let me use this. What about something like compensation? How do we typically do compensation as a common practice in most organizations? We, do and go get what? Comps across multiple different industries or whatnot. If that person made something over there, they've got to make that over here. And it, to me, is no different than this idea of machine paradigm where it's interchangeable parts. And it allows us to see things, hopefully more efficiency from the productivity standpoint in the mind of the operator or the team leader. But it does create some really substantial unintended consequences when every HR director across the world is all measured against other HR directors, right? In terms of how we're going to pay or compensate in that position. So that's just another example. I think we can go through lots and lots of examples. And the thing is what about these practices create disengagement? I mean, I don't know about you, but I know that when I'm treated like everybody else, or that we begin to commoditize something, it loses its at least perceived value, even if there is innate value. And what is it that we're doing unintentionally? I think the thing is so much good intentions in trying to change disengagement, but what is it about the design that may be reinforcing it unintentionally? So one of the things I want us to think about is when we're thinking about this machine design, one of the things that we've recognized is that it does something. It engineers this idea of best practices. And we had a conversation with a colleague yesterday, and when we talked about, so what is best practices? And he goes, well, actually, if everybody's practicing, it must be basic practices, right? It loses its meaning, right? And that was his, I'll give him credit. He was the founder at a marketing company. And so best practices, interestingly, actually reinforce this idea of prescriptive structures. Everybody treated the same, silver bullet solutions. Hey, if it worked there, it will work here. And that, what we believe, and we'll just speak for ourselves, we believe it degenerates health, right? Now, what's interesting, in a machine context, you can see why a real machine needs to work this way. You want it to be the same so that it reinforces a way to build that machine the same way next time so that you get the same outcomes you got from that last machine. But what's interesting about what we're talking about in complex issues or environments is that we're not machines. But if you treat us as machines, you degenerate health. But when we think about it from a life systems or a living systems perspective, what we want to do is inform principles. And those principles will facilitate a framework that's flexible so that we can regenerate health. And we really see that the majority of this is helping organizations recognize that disengagement and any other things we would want to talk about organizations is recognizing it from a design standpoint, and that we're going to help recognize that everything around that machine design requires an enormous amount of energy because we've got to keep it going. But a living systems design actually requires less energy. And I'm going to pause there and ask you guys the question, why would a living systems design require less energy? Anything off the top of people's heads?
I think that idea you mentioned a while back about being self-sustaining, autopoietic, the energy is distributed more and requires less, I don't know, singular inputs or something.
Yeah.
Self-sustaining.
Yeah, absolutely. So the system itself now can benefit from all of the life that's a part of that system. Versus usually machine needs outside inputs to make it continue. It can't self-maintain, and it definitely is not self-regenerating, right? So what we're doing is then spending time helping all of us. None of us are beyond this. It's so infiltrated everything that we're doing that we're helping everybody talk about what's the shift. How do we help in shifting both our perspectives and operations as a part of this process? And so when we talk about informing this, we again bring up this principle-based design. And so what does it look like for us to begin to design with these principles in mind, which are really derived straight out of a life-based system, that it truly is holistic and that we're designing with mutualism in mind. And we'll talk more specifically about this in a moment, about uniqueness and what people are bringing to the equation or to the environment of the organization. And what about it needs to be designed so that it evolves versus is static. Machines don't evolve. When the machine's no longer working, what do? You throw it out. And that it's decentralized and distributed, and that it really is designed with the development of the members in mind, right? It's ongoing health and growth of the members of that system. So what's interesting here when we talk about disengagement, I really want us to hone in on the fact that we don't value the uniqueness, what we call the original and the possibility of individual genius, excuse me, that every individual brings into a team or into an organization. And we begin to start to ask ourselves, well, there's no way we can design with that in mind because it would cost too much money. It would be inefficient. And we use all the same measures that we use to measure a machine. No, we need it to be the same. We need everybody to act the same. We need everybody to be the same so that we can get a predictable outcome. But the fact is, people aren't the same. You can't make them the same. And all of this disengagement that we're getting, both from an environmental standpoint, a social, economic standpoint, I believe is all geared to our design that's benefiting a few, but not the whole. So what we want to do is begin to say, not here is how you create an environment of disengagement. It's about what are the principles we use for you personally in your environment to create something that will engage people and create the conditions for them to thrive. And we believe that's what we think facilitates this idea of a flexible framework. And so we use this framework that we designed as a means to help organizations get clear on what the context is so that it's designed with real purpose And that's both in terms of roles and responsibilities, people and their engagement, as well as what we are providing as a valuable service to our customers or to those stakeholders as a part of this process. But what's interesting is we add this layer in there that's usually absent in most organizations, or at least the conversation, which is if it's a living system, living systems are evaluated, and you said a little bit of this earlier, Elliot, around its health, around the environment that it's creating, not just its ability to produce or the efficiencies that it can have. So what does it look like to begin to evaluate, not just based on outputs, but things that create the conditions for that outcome, but it is measured around the health of the system. And that health of the system begins to become something that we then design around. So what we say is, in organizational structures, we design structures to enable health that's within the purpose of the organization so that we can do the work that we are all inspired to do. But we need to design with that health in mind versus design with the work in mind. And if we can design an environment where people can thrive, we believe it's a natural occurring outcome to be able to create impactful work. And that is core to what we believe eliminates at least the possibility of disengagement at a chronic level. Now, with that in mind, we believe all of that creates the conditions for regeneration. So I was a part of an organization for many years called the Savory Institute. And the Savory Institute took these kinds of principles under the lineage of Alan Savory and the team to apply this to living systems like natural environments. And this is an actual photo of a place in Mexico that I've been to in the Chihuahua Desert. And this is what it was before they started recognizing that in a living system, we began to create the conditions for life to thrive, and then that creates all kinds of other outcomes that are far greater than we could possibly imagine. And it didn't require inputs, it required just a different management design. So how do you work with life versus work against it? By using principles that are based in life and frameworks that allow for ingenuity and creativity and all kinds of incredible energy versus what we tend to do, which is put people in a box, tell them this is what they need to be doing, and force them to be like everybody else. So with that in mind, what we see is really focusing our attention with these shifts. So we began to recognize the shift. We talk about from parts to wholes, recognizing that we're talking about whole people and not silos, and the uniqueness that exists as a part of a living system, or from competition to collaboration, and recognizing it's our connectedness that actually gives us energy in life. And the lack of that is actually death. I mean, scientifically, from a biological standpoint, that's the case. And we actually believe, because we are a part of living systems, we believe that to be the case as well. And from recipes to responses, which means we're looking to create the conditions for people to develop and bring their creativity and their uniqueness to what is actually happening in a living environment. And that we really are focusing our attention on potential, so the patterns that we began to see in these systems, versus trying to predict and project at the expense of the health of the system. I mean, the fact is I'll just pause here and say, the ability to produce, we've shown our ability to produce over and over again. It has worked. But what we're not measuring is at what expense. And at the beginning, I think we talked a little bit about what that expense looks like. And I think even more so, it's the expense of the potential that exists in the system and what we can do to change that. So we move from extraction to equity and recognize the mutualism that should exist and the power of that uniqueness, and recognizing power, or this all idea of command and control, really needs to be decentralized and distributed, and represents that nodal shift that needs to happen in our organizations. So here's what I want us to do. We're going to take a couple of minutes, and I want you to think of one practice that you could change immediately to create more energy on your team. Just one practice. And this idea of shifting from this machine paradigm to this life-giving paradigm. And then we're going to break up into groups, and you guys will get a chance to share that with one another. So let's take 5 minutes for you to think about it. Awesome. So in light of your experiences, anybody want to share anything, or some of the conversations you were having about what practice you could change that could immediately impact the energy of your team?
Well, we got slightly cut off, but we were both talking about, staff meetings, how to do staff meetings a little bit differently, a little bit better, weekly check-ins versus a little bit more of a, interactive kind of change it up, inject some energy into it type format.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. We actually find that at a kind of meaningful level across all organizations is if meeting structure is changed, it could have a substantial impact energy-wise across the organization. So, anybody else?
Our group talked a lot about meetings too.
Okay.
Yeah, I think everybody wants to reinvent their meeting. But yeah, similar to what was just shared, just envisioning a new way to interact with coworkers and get information exchanged in a more human way, I think, is ultimately what people are trying to do. But some of the ideas that were shared in our little breakout session were actually starting the meeting. This sounds simple, but starting the meeting by asking people how they're doing, and sharing like real niceties, or just wondering, checking in on a human level and realizing that we're humans here. Some other things were maybe not having this like a leader structure that you're feeling like you might challenge the person, and creating a better environment for conversation to be for and against topics that are being discussed. I think it might have been another one, I forget what it was, but yeah, very much meeting focused.
Great, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think those little steps, I think, actually goes a long way to begin creating a bridge to individuals feeling like that the environment cares more than just what they produce. And as we begin to do that, I think it does, I think, give people permission to think differently. And hopefully there are some organizations that will make a real substantial design change. And sometimes it just may be at the team level where people are taking an interest in one another, and that creates the energy for them to be doing something truly impactful versus just living the job. And I think there is real power in that. So one of the things I wanted us to end with, and then we'll close out today, just to be mindful of everybody's time, is, so when we think about this regenerative environment or regenerative organization, we see it as a living, evolving, and naturally functioning environment where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. So for us, everything we're talking about is designing with this in mind. that because we are living, these complex systems do evolve. And what does it look like to create that natural environment? And how do we make sure that productivity and efficiency, or what we call abundance and resilience, are actually outcomes of this underlying health versus the focus of our strategies, the focus of our design. So this is what we encourage us to make the move towards. So I'll end with a quote by many of who you probably know. Meadows: "The world is a complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, social, psychological, economic system. If we treat it as if it were not, as if it were divisible, separable, simple, and infinite, our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from this mismatch." And so I believe our organizations are a microcosm of exactly what we're talking about. That we're trying to apply a design that does not work in a living environment. And until we change the design and recognize that that is what we're a part of and in, I think we're going to continue to get these same kind of real, substantial, systemic challenges. So thanks, guys. And I just want to open it up for questions in the last few minutes, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Trey. And thank you all for your participation. So any kind of questions, we probably have time for one, maybe two questions or thoughts or reflections, really anything that's on your mind. Anyone? One question? All right, well, just a couple of closing announcements in that case. While this all kind of begins to sink in a couple of weeks, we're going to be offering, well, actually next week, we offer group coffee chats. We find that people have lots of questions about how to really practically land this and the different applications in their own contexts. And so I'll be sending an email after this with a couple of times in case you're interested in exploring any questions that you have once this has the chance to sink in a little bit. We also offer online courses. We're actually working on something that will enable us to offer online courses that address a number of organizational practices, everything from finance to HR, and how to land it in a regenerative way. So stay tuned for that. We also offer a Foundations online course going into really the foundational philosophies of our work. And so we'll be announcing the next one this fall soon. So please stay tuned. The Organizational Health Index, which actually can be applied at many different levels of systems, everything from organizations to communities to networks, really gives a great baseline understanding of the underlying health of the operations of the system that you're looking at. And if you're interested in that, please reach out. We'd be happy to talk with you. And in addition to that, we also offer support using the regenerative framework, from strategic planning to hiring in HR to operational support to helping people reimagine meetings and financial modeling. And of course, everything that we do is really custom engagement because we recognize that each client has a unique context. And lastly, I wanted to mention some of our partners, this organization at the Epicenter based out of Boulder. They put on a great conference every year that we wanted to give a shout out to. It's called the Regenerative Earth Summit. I think particularly relevant for folks working in agriculture and business and really wanting to look at accelerating systemic change for people and planet. So check it out. I'll include a link to that in the follow-up email along with the recording. And lastly, we'd really love your input on how to make these webinars even better and inform the design of future webinars. So we'll be sending along a survey and would love your input if you have a couple of minutes. So I think that's all. Just super grateful for all of your time today. And Trey, thank you so much. Loved the webinar. And yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or if there's any way we could be a resource to you all. Thanks.